Welcome. I think we are going to get started. My name is Daniela Bleichmann. I am the director of the Lehman Institute for the Humanities at USC, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this book chat where we will be discussing Nathan Perl-Rosenthal new-ish book, The Age of Revolutions and the Generations Who Made It. I would like to start by thanking our partners for this program, the Hunnick History Department at USC, the Department of French and Italian, and the Early Modern Studies Institute. Today, Nathan will be joining conversation by Professors David Armitage, who is a Lloyd C. Blankfein Professor of History at Harvard University, and Marlene Daut, who is a Professor of French and African Diaspora Studies at Yale University. And the conversation will be moderated by Bob Shrum, the director of the Center for the Political Future and the Carmen H. and Louis Warsaw Chair in Practical Politics at USC. We will begin with Nathan giving a very brief introduction to his book. And after that, Professors Daut and Armitage will engage him in conversation for roughly 30-35 minutes. And we will have the last 15 minutes of the hour for questions from the audience, moderated by Professor Shrum. And when that time comes, please use your Zoom hand to indicate that you have a question. Nathan, many congratulations, and please tell us about your book.
Thanks so much. Thank you so much, Daniela and the Levin Institute for making this possible, all the other co-sponsors, and a huge thank you to Bob, to David, to Marlene for agreeing to be the interlocutors and the showrunner. And to everyone really for coming. It's sort of overwhelming to see this many people whose work I admire in one Zoom room. So I'm just going to really try to briefly talk about what made me want to write this book, what sort of was the framing for coming to this topic, and then talk briefly about the sort of way of proceeding that I adopted, and then say a little bit about where I think it led me. So this project is something that really has been gestating, I would say, really almost my entire career, which is not that long, but you know, as long as I've had a career. And it really started, I would say, almost when I first read R.R. Palmer's Age of the Democratic Revolution. And so I've been fascinated by the Age of Revolutions and trying to understand what this Age of Revolutions is about. And just to explain what I mean by that when I'm talking about an Age of Revolutions, for my purposes, it's really a period from about the 1760s to the 1820s in the Atlantic world, broadly speaking, although that includes some of the Pacific world too, and other places. The American Revolution, Haitian Revolution, the French Revolution, Spanish American Revolutions. And this is really the axial age of modern politics is kind of the way I think about it. The moment in which the democratic Republican politics that sort of define our world today begin to spread more widely, come into form. Democratic republicanism grounded in the sovereignty of the people begins to become a thing that's spreading widely. Not by any means the end of that, but the beginning of it. And so Palmer and Hobsbawm, R.R. Palmer's Age of the Democratic Revolution and Eric Hobsbawm's The Age of Revolutions, which are two books from the late 50s, early 60s, have really defined what it means to talk about the Age of Revolutions as a whole. There's lots of scholarship on individual revolutions, but when you think about them together as a set of revolutions that have some kind of coherence, and I'll come back to that, those have been the two works. And they're magnificent books, I'll just say that. They really are, really masterful. But they're really quite dated at this point. I mean, I was surprised when I was thinking about it today. We're as far from Palmer as Palmer was from the turn of the 20th century. We're as far from Palmer as Palmer was from Alphonse Hollard, the first academic historian of the French Revolution. And so in thinking about these books, the account they give of what the Age of Revolution is, how it happens, why it matters, it leaves a lot out. It leaves a lot, one wanting a lot more. And as I was thinking about trying to come up, with think about this book, it was clear that there were a number of things I thought that needed to happen. This needed to be a book that talked about Europe and the Americas, but also the Caribbean and also South America, not just North America. And it needed to be socially broad. It needed to think not only about men, not only about elite men, but also about women. It needed to think about not only elites, but also the middling people and the dispossessed of various kinds. And so obviously this is a large, sprawling topic. And so I tried to come up with a way of proceeding through this, a method that I thought respected or could respect this kind of what I saw as a diversity in unity of the Age of Revolutions. The fact that they are distinct revolutions with distinct quiddities, but also that they're all pretty clearly connected to one another. And this is how I ended up with really a focus on practice, which is what this book in some ways really is about, is a history of revolutionary practice. By practice, I mean thinking about ways of doing things, thinking about processes. And here I'm thinking in particular about theorists like Pierre Bourdieu or Michel de Certeau, who sort of the key theorists of practice from my point of view. And so I'm much less interested in this book, and I hesitate to say this on a Zoom in which there are many historians of ideas, but this is not really a book about ideas. We're not centrally about a history of ideas, and it's also not really centrally a history of revolutionary outcomes. Exactly. It's what I'm really most interested in is process. And I think practice, or I hope that practice allows me to get at both local specificity, at the ways in which we do things in one place, and the ways in which those things that we do are connected regionally, globally, transnationally. You may eat in one place with one kind of utensil or another, but you're still eating. And so what I ended up, as I sort of pursued this history of revolutionary practice, was really a history of political organizing. That came to be the sort of central piece of the story. Trying to think about, it's not the only thing that matters by any means in the Age of Revolutions. I think you can write the history of the Age of Revolutions from other perspectives, but I chose to write it really from the perspective of political organizing. And here I'm also drawing on historical sociologists like Charles Tilly, who've made the argument that, but also Lynn Hunt's work on political organizing, political practice, and thinking about revolution as something not that magically appears out of nowhere, but actually has to be built, constructed. And in particular, to think about the ways in which the success or failure of political organizing, the ability to build large-scale movements, political movements, shapes the degree to which revolutionary ideas, revolutionary policies, revolutionary visions can be brought into reality or not. There was a tension, though, between this interest in practice and process and the way we think about revolutionary politics. Revolutionary politics is thought of as transformation. That's sort of the groundwork of the field. But practice actually has a tendency to be rather sticky. And this is, again, very much a Bourdieuvian thought. The idea that practice is, deeply ingrained in habit. It's also, in a way, an 18th century thought. If you think of John Locke on education, right? The idea that habit is deeply ingrained, almost reflexive. So out of this tension, in a way, between practice and the creation of new kinds of politics, emerged really the thesis of the book, which is this generational thesis. So the argument ultimately of the book is a Bourdieuvian one, and a generational one, because I think Bourdieuvian arguments are generational, but it's an argument about the way in which people who come up in an old world eventually manage to become revolutionaries. And I would say that one of the main ways that I'm arguing with the many who have come before me, including Tim Tackett and Lynn Hunt and others, is that I think it takes a really long time. So the first generation, as I argue in this book, is deeply embedded, has deeply embedded within it, I would say, old regime practices, ways of looking at the world, in particular, a deeply hierarchical view of the world. And that this makes it very difficult for them to organize durable, large-scale movements that can actually hold together over time. And I have many, many illustrations of this that I try to offer. But repeatedly in the first half of the book, what you see is movements coming into being and then falling apart, either under their own contradictions or under external pressures, which lead to sort of internal ruptures or made possible by internal ruptures. this, I think, leads then to some degree of political change. But the real change, I think, or the most profound change, let's say, is actually in the minds, in the worldviews, in the habituses of the second generation who were born, let's say, from the around 1760 onwards, who grow up in a world in which the social order of the old regime is, if not collapsing, at least cracking. And really what the second half of the book tries to show is that this second generation, again, diversity and unity. It's different in different places. This process proceeds in different places, but I think in every place it is proceeding in a similar way, at its own pace. This second generation has a set of much more socially flexible worldviews, much more of an understanding of the ability, the necessity to work across social divides, whether they're class divides or racial divides. And it's the second generation, really, after 1800, that's able to organize mass politics. Now, this is going to sound all very cheerful, I know, and I'm almost done, I promise. But I think the second generation, in fact, has a rather illiberal tint. And I'll just leave it at that illiberal tint, and pass on the baton.
So it's time for David to, you want to kick this off, David, and ask the first question, and then we're going to have a conversation involving David, Marlene, and Nathan.
So it'd be a pleasure to kick this off. Thank you, Bob, and congratulations, Nathan, on a remarkable achievement. You've just told us with your customary eloquence and charisma why you wanted to write this book and why it turned out the way it did for you. I want to turn the lens around and just ask, on behalf of your readers, why the Age of Revolutions and why now? What is it about the Age of Revolutions that might speak to a contemporary reader? Is this a just so story about the origins of how we came to be who we are? Is it an allegory of generational divisions and collisions? Or is there something else that you would like your readers to get from the book that would bridge that gap between the late 18th, early 19th centuries and the early 21st century?
Well, I mean, it's a fascinating way to look at it. And I'm surprised that question is coming from you, because I would have thought that, in a sense, I pushed as hard as I wanted to, or as I was willing to connect to the present. I don't want to sound like a starry-eyed, crazy optimist here, but I do think the study of the past is its own reward. We don't have to have, it doesn't have to teach us lessons as the 18th century historians always thought it did. But it isn't. I think what it isn't is maybe clearer than what it is. You mentioned generational division, and that's of course I think a reference to Mannheim, and it's really not a Mannheimian story that I tell, and that's why I keep citing Bourdieu. I mean, Bourdieu tells very much a story about generational connection, and I think in a sense, do we live in an age of revolutions? Fareed Zakaria, whose book was reviewed with mine several times, thinks we still live in an age of revolutions. I don't know that we live in an age of revolutions, but I think the question that the age of revolutions poses, let's say, there is a genealogical dimension to this, of course, right? This is, yes, a bit of a story about how we get to be who we are. But I think in a sense, the thing that's always fascinated me about the age of revolutions is that it's kind of the story of transformation in the modern world, or one of the stories, maybe not the only one. And so I think if you're thinking about how might things come to be, what might be to quote the title of a certain institute, the political future might be, you might want to think back to the 18th century, because I think in a sense, we're always, and this is, we're always reliving. Some people think the French Revolution, some people think the American Revolution. So in that sense, I guess trying to make the case in this book that revolutionary change even, that political change is a slow process. And I guess I had in mind, some of as I was writing this, I had in mind some of the current political movements, which are struggling so hard to make change in the world, and it's so difficult. And I guess I had this maybe fantasy that perhaps someone will read this and think, oh, it's okay that this is taking much longer than I expect, because it always takes much longer than you expect. I mean, to me, even the French Revolution takes 40 years, basically, to get where it, even was trying to get.
Well, that might speak to the idea familiar to many of the characters you're dealing with, that there is a Newtonian process here of action and reaction. For every revolution, there is a counter-revolution. And as you're well aware, there are many other scholars, including some on this call, who've been urging us to think about the processes of counter-revolution in the age of revolutions, both as part of the historical processes of the time, but also of harbingers towards the future, again, partly explaining why social movements for reform and transformation can take so long, because they face so many countervailing forces. Would you like to reflect a little bit about the age of revolutions and age of counter-revolutions? Not a topic you deal with head-on in the book, but one I'm sure you've thought a lot about.
Yeah, I think I tend to think about, the trouble that I have with a lot of some of the work on counter-revolution, not all of it, but some of it is that it can tend to externalize the things we don't like. It can become a way. I'm not saying that it always is, but it can become a way of saying, well, implicitly, I think in a curiously naive way, because the work is actually very sophisticated, it can actually be a way of saying, well, counter-revolution is the things we don't like that happened during this period. And part of what the case that I'm trying to make in this book, maybe bizarrely, is that the counter-revolution is kind of within. That part of the resistance is not just, kings who don't want to lose their crowns and noblemen who are unhappy about, loss of their tax privileges, but it's actually even the people who are supposedly, 100% for revolution, actually have ways of thinking, sort of structures in the mind that make it quite hard to and sort of thwart themselves in a sense. So I guess that's the way I try to think about counter-revolution, and it's it's not to say that, of course, there isn't resistance from outside, and that there aren't ideological counter formations that are developing here. But that's more or less the way that I tried to think about, to think with that scholarship, was to think about the ways in which it's internalized rather than externalized.
And I think that comes through beautifully clearly in the way in which you use, in a very supple manner, that idea of generations, not of a single generation having a single viewpoint or direction towards the future, but the generations themselves being internally fragmented and engaged in contestation. And even, as you say, individuals themselves at different points and for different purposes, finding themselves fighting with themselves about where to go next, or how far to go, or whether to head forward at all. By the end of the book, in your engagement with that idea of revolutions, did you come to believe that generations itself is a useful historical tool in other places for other purposes? Because it's relatively novel in your usage. It's familiar, as you mentioned, from Karl Mannheim a long time ago, but it hasn't been used terribly often recently. Would you advocate for a broader use in your supple way of constructing revolutions by other historians?
Well, it's funny. I was just on a Zoom the other day, which we were having this conversation, and on that Zoom there happened to be 3 of us who were interested in generations. So it was starting to seem like a social movement, very small social movement, but still. And I guess the case that I made on that Zoom, and I think the case that we were all making, was, yeah, generations. It's a way of slicing up the social body, which is a little bit unhabitual for historians, but unless you want to be completely either arbitrary or claim to be doing a sort of total history, we're always engaged in some kind of fragmenting, whether it be racial or gender-based or class-based, right? There's always some kind of slicing. I think slicing into some kind of, and it's always imprecise, right? I mean, to varying degrees. I feel like there are about 20 years of the historical profession that were wasted on trying to figure out how you could define classes. right, about 2 generations ago. And generations have similar problems, right? I mean, the natural question is, well, you know, when does one start and one end? And of course, the answer, equally natural answer is there's no start and end day, right? It's kind of, and of course, there are, you know, ways that generational analysts have developed to think about that question, thinking about, and Mannheim, of course, talks about them as well, right? Sort of precipitating events that can create a set of common experiences, which is part of what I'm arguing in the sort of the hinge part of the book, is that there are a set of generative, somewhat shared experiences around the Atlantic world. So to me, it's a tool like any other for slicing up the social world. It seems odd to me. I mean, it isn't odd because it's just the way it is, but it does seem odd that historians are so reluctant to use it when we're so apt to use so many other highly imprecise, you know, ways of slicing up the social body. And it does seem to me, I mean, I'll tell you, I had the experience, I gave a talk about the book and to about 100 students. And I said at one point, trying to sort of make the case for this generational thesis. So do you, students, raise your hand if you think that your worldview is the same as that of your parents, or sorry, is different from that of your parents? And 99 hands went up. I mean, I'd never tried it before, but literally all but one student, that poor student, I then was like, what's the matter with you? But all but one student, their vision, their understanding of themselves was that they looked at the world in a different way than their parents. So all the more so in the late 18th century, it seems to me, and at other sort of breaking points, juncture points. So yeah, I mean, I think it's a hugely useful tool. And I think the problem, sorry, I'm getting prolix here, but I do think there was a moment when people did generations, in the 70s especially. There were several generation books. To my mind, one of the problems with those books is there's always one generation, not 2 or 3. And it's, you know, I think it's you sort of lost a sense of change over time, I think. But, you know, it's a fundamental aspect of change over time, it seems to me. And so it should be part of our toolkit. At least that's, seems to me, should be. But I would think that.
Marlene, can we get you in on this?
Yes, actually, this is kind of the perfect moment for me to jump in. But first, I wanted to say congratulations to Nathan for this wonderful book. I really enjoyed reading it. Can't wait to talk about so many in the weeds things, but I'll try to keep it general for now. You know, I'm so happy the conversation is turned towards generations, because I really thought the age of revolutions, of course, needs revision, but we live in a world awash in generations. How many articles in the New Yorker or the Atlantic will hear about Gen Z, Gen Alpha? They're literally about their language that they're using, how they're using words differently with different definitions from the way that we all use them in quote unquote our generation. So I find it maybe would be helpful for those who haven't read the book if you kind of went back to how you are defining generation in terms of specifically time. Because I found that when I saw the way that you discussed Toussaint Louverture, Dessalines, Christophe in particular, there's a sense that a large swath of time has passed, but they are still all from the same generation, if you will. So I wonder if you could talk about how part of the process of maybe why it seems slow is that we're all, like, all the generations are moving through time together, right? Not separately.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Right. So, I mean, I think one of the questions in thinking about generations, and this has been, you know, I think amply sort of laid out, and Mannheim sort of laid it out about 100 years ago, and more recently there have been a number of other books that have, you know, scholars who kind of laid it out. I mean, there are several different ways of thinking about generations, right? There's a possibility that there are experiences that a group of people of the same age have, which affect them all in some shared way. And therefore, they carry in some ways the imprint of that experience with them through time. There's the possibility of age-related effects, right? So that's what they talk about as like the difference between 20-year-olds and 70-year-olds, right? Pretty consistently, there are changes over the aging process. And there are other kinds of sort of generational effects that one can talk about. The one that I was primarily interested in here was the way in which the difference, to put it sort of in shorthand, between someone born in 1735 versus someone born in 1765, whether in North America or France or in the Caribbean. It seems to me that they experience a very different young adulthood, perhaps a very, very different childhood, which leaves a kind of imprint. And the kind of imprint that I try to make the case for is an appreciation in the second generation of the possibilities of social mobility. Social mobility is kind of a positive way of describing it, but let's say the sort of changeability in social and political and economic status. The case I make is that the middle of the 18th century is actually really quite hierarchical, quite frozen in place socially and economically. And that's really much less the case at the end of the 18th century. And again, I'm sort of saying this in a positive way, but it's partly because there's giant wars, which are very disruptive of the social and economic order. So I do think that Christophe is a good example of what I think of as the second generation, not of the first. I think Louverture really belongs to the first generation. Christophe, to my mind, more belongs to the second, in the sense that he sort of comes up in the context of the American Revolution, and I think has from a fairly early age this sense of the mobility of flexibility of the social order, more I would say than Louverture, but I'm talking to someone who just wrote the biography of Christophe, so I'm not gonna claim to know more about Christophe than you. That's for sure. Which I am very, very excited to read.
Marlene, is he right?
Well, the question that I had, I guess, is how slavery would affect the thesis of the generations, though, because I hear you very much so, and the differences between, for example, the way that Toussaint Louverture thinks and the way that Henri Christophe thinks, but partially that's because Christophe lives for so much longer, right? Because we don't know what Toussaint would have thought or done, and if he would have resembled more in terms of his approach to sovereignty and statecraft had he lived, and really kind of the same with Dessalines. So I guess I'm wondering, if you are an enslaved person, there could be social mobility and kind of revolutions going on all around you, but if they don't directly affect you, then how do you fit into the generations mode?
So, I'm sort of a follower here of the Scott thesis, that news travels very efficiently around the Caribbean and, around among the enslaved. Julius Scott, his book, The Common Wind, is kind of a classic in Caribbean history, I would say. It seems to me that, the difference between 1750, when there hasn't been a major or the major uprisings of the enslaved have been, put down very effectively, and the slave regime in the Caribbean and North America is growing rapidly still, right? And it's becoming only more and more entrenched around the Atlantic world. The difference between that and even 1780, when, the Haitian Revolution hasn't taken place yet, there hasn't been an anti-slavery revolt, but there has been the American Revolution, which freed thousands of enslaved people who, as one of David's colleagues has shown, get around quite a lot. Christophe himself has direct knowledge of this world. So I think the knowledge of the kind of awareness of these possibilities can exist without it changing one's status right away. That's not to say that one doesn't want it to change one's status, but I don't know that in terms of worldview, the actual experience of freedom is the whole shebang. Like, I think also the knowledge of the possibility of that, and the increasing possibility of that as the century comes to a close, I think is significant. That's the argument that I would make, and I think that holds for non-elite people in cities as well, right? For sort of white workers who also are not seeing an improvement in their conditions of life. I'm not obviously making a comparison or claiming that there's any similarity between the experience of being a working class white man and an enslaved person. Those are obviously completely different statuses, but Similarly, in one sense, the revolutions do not instantly transform people's lives, but I think they do create the sense that such possibilities are available. I guess that would be how I would. But maybe that's too. Does that seem too vague to you, Marlene?
No, no, not at all. I mean, I think I'm also interested in how the next generations affect again, along that idea of time, that if, all the generation, like we might think differently from our parents, but we're still all living together and then with our grandparents and in the same generation. So, and where you get to at the end of the book is, you use the word illiberal a lot. So maybe I'll let you say what you kind of, and I mean, I don't disagree with you that many of these revolutions or how they turned out were very illiberal, but I feel like, especially for, we use the words counter-revolution, liberal, we use them differently than people would think of them today, I mean, historically speaking. So I wonder if you can speak to that, why the American Revolution, and I felt like you were gesturing towards the Civil War there, because we're getting up Missouri Compromise and all of that, but could you talk about what you mean about how that's how they ended up, I guess, that illiberality?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, so I borrowed the word from my advisor Isser Wallach, who wrote a wonderful article many years ago called "On the Latent Illiberalism of the French Revolution." It's actually a review of François Furet's critical dictionary of the French Revolution. So I felt like if Isser, who is a stickler of all sticklers for historical accuracy, was willing to use the word illiberal for this period, I was okay doing the same. And what I'm really trying to get at there, and there were other ways of saying it. They were just more long-winded, most of them. What I was trying to get at is the idea that freedom for some is purchased at lack of freedom for others, which is really not, I think, the vision of many people have of the 1770s and 80s and 90s, right? There's this idea of kind of universal liberation. And I think what I found so interesting and compelling, troubling about the post-1800 revolutionary world is that there seems to be an acceptance that that's not going to happen. The revolutions seem to all arrive by one route or another at the conclusion that you can arrive at liberation for some, but only for others. And there are famous illustrations of this. I think the Haitian illustration is a strong one. Although again, I speak, as they say here in Paris, sous le contrôle of specialists. The sort of compromise of monarchy as a way to protect personal freedom, right? To maintain the freedom of the people, but only by really quite repressive means. But in the United States as well, right? The creation of white man's democracy during the 18 teens and 1820s. It's famously the New York State Constitution of 1821, right? Expands voting rights to almost all white men, and closes them off to black men who until then, with property, who until then had. But I think it's in every textbook, but it's in every textbook. It's the textbook example of that process. And I think what I'm trying to argue is that that's a generalized process around the Atlantic world, that it's not an American exception. It's not some kind of, you'll forgive the expression, some kind of, Haitian dysfunction, which I think tends to be the way that people talk about Latin America and Haiti, right? That there's something wrong here. But actually the exact same, or similar things seem to be wrong in the North Atlantic, the European and North American democratic experiments. So that's what I'm trying to get at, and by trying to bring those together. So, I mean, just to come back to the generations question, I think part of what is in play in the generational thinking is to try to create separation vertically in time and to bring together horizontally more than has been done. I think the typical way of thinking about these revolutions is as horizontally separated and vertically integrated, or more vertically integrated. And I really wanted to try to make the case that there was a horizontal commonality around the Atlantic pre and post 1800, which doesn't trump local similarities, right? I mean, this is not a history of revolutionary circulation. It's really a history of revolutions that are connected, but distinct, have their own quiddity. But I really wanted to emphasize that shift, and that's sort of the shorthand that I was using to describe it. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to actually explain what I meant by that.
In about 6 minutes, we're going to open this up to questions. You'll do it by raising your hand, and then I'll call on people. But for the next 5-6 minutes, I'd like to give David and Marlene another chance to weigh in with what they think maybe is the most significant question that this book raises.
I'll go first, I guess. As you were just talking now, Nathan, I actually had the thought, like, so the age of revolutions was not that revolutionary. Like, would you agree with that? What would you say if someone said, that's my takeaway from this book?
Oh yeah, I've heard that one before. You can even find it in print about things I've written. I think it depends what you mean by revolutionary. And I have an article about that too. I think we have a very, how to put this? I think the way that we tend to talk about revolution kind of loosely as transformation, as breaking points. This was kind of sacralized by, oh my goodness, his name is, I'm having a trou de mémoire. Anyway, whatever his name is, the idea that revolution is a kind of breaking point in time. I think that's wrong. Yeah, I think that's wrong. I don't buy that vision of revolution. And I think if you spend time in the archives, how could you? I mean, anyone who sat in the archives of a revolutionary archive, yes, you see things that change. You see things that are transformed. You see new ways of speaking, new ways of doing paperwork. But I mean, go and look at prints, for instance. The people who are making the prints in 1775 are the same people who are making the prints in 1800, or the people who were trained by them. There is a tremendous amount of continuity across revolutionary divides. And I think, look, we're historians, our job is to think about change and continuity. And I think it's just a question of where we strike that balance. Is it transformative in a kind of total way? I tend to think not. I guess I'm skeptical about those claims. So yes, if the question is revolution totally transformative, and am I saying that that's not the case, then yes, I don't think that's the case. But that doesn't mean I don't think that revolution isn't happening in the way certainly the people in the 18th century understood it, because they do have an incredibly capacious, much more capacious, I think, than us, view of what revolution is. But I hope that, I mean, so much changes over this period. So I hope nobody comes away with the idea, well, nothing really happened. That would be why did I read those 560 pages?
Well, thinking of pages, just the very opening page, as you'll remember, of Eric Hobsbawm's Age of Revolution, just lays out the enormous transformations of the period. Key ideas, as well as the practices they describe, like industry, revolution itself is revolutionized, the ultimate transvaluation of democracy from something negative to something positive, liberalism, liberal and liberalism. So many of these terms, ideas, practices, and institutions take on their recognizably modern form in this period. So I want to actually turn this back and say, well, you said at the very beginning that you're not interested in ideas. But as Trotsky might have said, ideas are interested in you. I know you've thought a lot about this. How would you put ideas back into an account which is so dazzlingly social and social political come institutional? But without ideas, there is no motivation. And without motivation, there are no revolutions.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I have a distinct memory of you, David, once many years ago, talking about someone's work and saying, if he's just saying that you could just do a history without ideas, which is just like sawing off the branch you're standing on. So I frequently think of that. So, I don't think ideas don't matter by any means. Of course they do. And I think they are absolutely among the motive forces. I suppose I felt like I didn't think we needed a history of ideas of the age of revolution, because I think the historians of ideas have done a really bang-up job of it, of accounting for some of the ideas that are driving revolutionary transformation, and thinking about the ideas, let's say, that come out of them in the sense of constitutionalism. I mean, I say at some point in the introduction, this is really not a history of constitutions, and it's not because I don't think constitutions are important, because they're immensely important. I mean, but there is so much work that's been done on constitutions, and part of what I felt I wanted to do was to try to, we're never supposed to say this, so if you're a graduate student on this call, stop listening right now. But I wanted to more fill the gap that I perceived rather than try to do everything, which is not what you're supposed to do. But I did feel like, there was a large gap, a field-sized gap that was worth filling. And I didn't think that I was going to be able to contribute as much by really telling the story of the story through ideas. So it's a little bit of a cop-out that I feel that, it's a little bit been done, including by present company, both of you. So I felt like, there was so much to build on there, whereas for a kind of an account that actually tries to take the kind of on-the-ground practices seriously, I thought that was much more absent. Frankly, I think Palmer himself is pretty good on the history of ideas, and that actually holds up pretty well. The problem is, there's a lot more going on, and so you end up with, assertions which to me no longer make any sense in Palmer. Things like, 1799 is the high point of European democracy, but then he says things like, but of course the people who are saying this have no contact with with ordinary people, which sort of, to me, in 1959 was maybe a thing you could say. Now it seems implausible, right? You can't claim that democracy is at its apogee and the people who are doing the democratic thought have no awareness of actual ordinary people. That seems broken to me. But I hope that the book is in dialogue, at least, or can be in dialogue with historians of ideas, and that that maybe there are, just come back to the generational question, maybe there are generational ways of thinking about the ideas of the period as well, more directly, in the longue durée, which I think we're all trying to, in our own way, get back to as much as we can.
It will be left to the next generation to join ideas and practices in the age of revolution.
This is sort of starting to sound like the grand unified theory of everything.
Yeah. The Einstein of historians. Let's have people raise their hands. They want to ask a question. Elizabeth, go ahead.
Thank you so much. Speaking of grand unified theories, I wanted to ask how far backward and forward you would take the generational interpretation in understanding early modern and modern history.
Yikes. I think I'm just going to go back to making the case that I think generations are a useful tool. But they're a tool like anything else. They're a way of, as I said, slicing the social body. So there are contexts, I would say, in which, like any method, they're only as useful as the question as useful as they are useful for the question that you're asking. So if you're asking a question that goes over a long period of time and there is some significant generational change, if there's some reason to think that there is generational change, or that some of the generational effects like aging are particularly consequential, then I think it matters. If you're in some kind of stasis chamber, which I doubt you are, or your people are in stasis chambers and nothing's changing, then maybe it's not so useful. But again, I think the usefulness of it will depend on the questions you're asking. So I'm not sure that that's a very satisfying answer, but it's an honest one.
Next person. Arturo. Yes.
Hi, thanks. Hi, Nathan. This is a really exciting book.
Thank you.
And so I wanted to come back to the point you were making. You were kind of in conversation with David about what you're calling kind of procedure or process and how it connects to ideas. I wanted to ask you about the Bourdieuian framework that you're using. For context, I'm a political theorist. I'm a political science professor. When I think of Bourdieu and the link between practice or habitus and ideas, I tend to conceive of them as reflexively connected, right? So if we were to say, in your case, write, or as you did, write a book that emphasizes the habitus of revolution in the age of revolutions and kind of rethinking that process. But subsequently, you were saying, I think that the work has been done in terms of the ideas. How would you kind of do that? How would you do that in a Bourdieuian sense, right? Do you, in the process of rethinking the practice, did you also rethink the ideas as you were writing it? Basically, is what I'm thinking.
Great, yeah, great question. I mean, I think I think it depends on what we mean by ideas. I suppose when I was talking with David, I was using a very blunt and probably old-fashioned. Well, I was using ideas in a very blunt and old-fashioned kind of way to think about, let's say, political theories, to think about constitutions, to think about, ideas about the political order at a fairly high level. And I think you're absolutely right that there is, that Bourdieu is definitely interested centrally in the way in which ideas, right? I mean, his Bourdieu's theory in the Outline of Theory of Practice is about the ways in which essentially the social order becomes internalized as a set of ideas, right? A matrix, a worldview, an habitus. And that habitus contains ideas about the way the social order is, the way the world works. I mean, it's a kind of social physics almost, right? A sort of a sense of how all of the pieces of the social order are going to fit together normally, and thus how you navigate within it. So in that sense of ideas, 100%, then my response to David, if that were what I had been thinking about when he was saying this is actually totally a history of ideas. It's a history of ideas about the social order, and the way in which they transform and the way in which they motivate or become or facilitate different kinds of political action, political organizing and political action. So thank you for making me sound much better than I did before. I appreciate that, making me much more coherent. But you're absolutely 100% right. So yes, there's two different ways of thinking about ideas, but yeah, definitely. Thank you.
Daniela, you have your hand up.
I do. I love, as you can imagine, Nathan, the ambition of the book and all the things that you connect, and the geographical scope, the insistence on anti-exceptionalism, as you describe it in the introduction. So I wanted to ask you about something that hasn't come up yet at all, which is your choice to look at such a range of places that do not often get brought together, as we all specialize in, regions rather than entire continents. So some terms that have not come up are comparative or connected, and also something that hasn't come up is the role of the Spanish American, both cases that you study, but also of the historiography. And so I would love to hear you talk about sort of how you think about the relationship between these things, and what the entire historiography that has been discussed has been Anglophone or French theory. So I wanted to hear what, doing the enormous work that you did to master a whole other literature, how that changes. How is this book different because of looking at the Hispanophone and whatever language you may be, literature in the Americas?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, well, thank you. Thank you for bringing that up. I mean, I will just say, I guess, the first thing I feel like I should say is it has been the most humbling in every sense part of writing this book, trying to get my arms around Spanish America, to the extent that I was capable of doing it. And I'm actually grateful to be able to acknowledge more than one person on this call, including Clément Thibault, but also Francisco Ortega, who helped me understand how to even begin approaching that, because trying to approach a new region is vertiginous. I remember standing in the UCLA library and looking at the section of the library on Peru and just thinking something unprintable. I mean, it was just terrifying. And so I had enormous debts in trying to address that. But I did it because it seemed to me that it was not possible today to write a history of the Age of Revolutions that didn't take seriously Spanish America. Both what happens before 1800, but especially what happens after 1800. It seems to me that to leave that out, a world that's deeply connected to the rest of to the North Atlantic, to the Caribbean, would just leave the book with just gaping holes in it. I'm surprised nobody has mentioned some of the other places that I don't cover. Obviously, my interlocutors are being polite, but there are plenty of places that I don't cover, but nobody can do everything. But I felt that Spanish America was essential, and it was just extraordinary. I learned in working in the Spanish archives, saw a different way of organizing archives. The archives are organized in a completely different way than the French or Anglo-American archives. And that, I think, really confirmed me in my firm belief that revolutions are not just connective in this period, but that they are quite individual, that they have their own particularities. I was also just really struck in the Spanish American revolutions by the role of women, which is kind of has no equal among the other revolutions of the era. I mean, this is in the book, but it's buried in a sentence somewhere. A third of the people who were executed at the end of the Tupac Amaru revolt in 1780-81 are women. I don't think there is any other revolution anywhere in the Atlantic world over the next 30 years in which women are executed in that large numbers, in which women are regarded as leaders of the movement in that large numbers. So again, I think, yes, I think it shifted my perspective not only by enlarging it, but also made me really attentive to things that I might not have been as attentive to in the North Atlantic context as well. I mean, I could go on and on, but I probably shouldn't. But thank you for letting me say something about that.
Francisco Ortega says he doesn't know how to raise his hand in Zoom, so I'm going to call on him anyway and let him ask this question.
Thank you, Bob, and thanks,
Hi, Francisco.
It's great to see you again, and congratulations.
Likewise.
I'm very happy. I haven't read it, but I'm definitely looking forward to read it. I just read the chapters that you sent us. I have a couple of questions. Just the first one is actually a bit more of a curiosity. How do you went around selecting the biographies? So you have a number of lives that you follow, and that pretty much work for you in terms of the generations. How do you make sense out of all this? I mean, there's myriads of lives and experiences that weave across Atlantic. What was the criteria that you used to do that? The second one, it's more of a question in terms of, and I have to say, by the way, I'm very excited about you, finally seeing Latin America squarely within the age of revolutions. It's been a long trip, and I think a lot of us that are here are very excited about that. And just that's why we have a lot to talk about. But you included the native uprising of the Andes, right? Within a lot of the historiography in Latin America, the Andes, that uprising will be somewhat really, kind of the old uprisings, not quite a revolution. So I was thinking, trying to see how that fits. But one thing that nags me is that you talk about the age of revolutions mainly in terms of popular sovereignty and the importance of democratic thought and practices and institutions and so on, right? When you go back to that, I just wrote a piece on democracy in Latin America from that period, and it went back to that period and I really didn't find. So my question's up, and obviously there's a lot to talk about here.
And Nathan, you have about 2 minutes to answer this.
I'm not going to do justice to this on Francisco, but fortunately, this won't be the last conversation we have about it. I'm also, I should just say before I sort of respond, the Spanish translation is actually coming out in 3 weeks in Spain, and then supposedly a month later in Latin America. So it exists. It's very long, as you can imagine. But I'm very excited about that. So I'm hoping that, you know, that dialogue can continue. The lives, I mean, so, you know, I felt very strongly that it needed to be a variety, you know, there needed to be a range of individuals from different regions, South America, North America, the Caribbean, Europe. That was, I think, one sort of foundational criterion. I thought, again, partly because of the work that I'd done in Latin America, both men and women, both white and non-white was important. And honestly, once you've applied that many criteria, are not as broad as one might think. I mean, there are not that many people who are not super duper famous who have enough of an archive to let you say much of anything about them. That's not to say that I chose the only ones, but you know, there weren't 100 people to choose from in a lot of these places and based on a lot of these criteria. That said, I almost think, I mean, I remember being asked this question about a year ago, 2 or 3 years ago. And I said, you know, in a sense, I don't think it matters. I could have picked someone else. Because what I think of these lives is as kind of portals into these social scenes, into these social worlds. I'm less interested, this is not a biographical book. I'm really interested in these biographies and in these lives as tunnels into locations, into social scenes, into you know, the worlds around them. And so I think in that sense, not that it doesn't matter, right? Because there is always, I mean, I'm talking to someone who's just written a biography, so I'm really, really digging here. But I do think, you know, use it to emphasize the individuality of people, or you can, you know, I think use it or both to really use biography as an opening into a wider social scene. And I was certainly leaning heavily in the second direction rather than in the first, which is part of why I didn't choose people who were super famous, right? I could have done Napoleon. That would have been really easy. There's so much written about Napoleon.
That would have been a long book. If every biographical subject had been of that status, the book would have been, I think, probably 10 times as long. This has been an engaging and enlightening discussion about an exciting book. And I'm going to turn this back over to Daniela.
Thank you so much. I'm so sorry, Nathan. That's all we have time for. I know that there's more questions and much more conversation to have, but we are at time. So I want to thank David Armitage, Marlene Daut, and Bob Shrum for their participation in this book chat. Thank you all for coming. We have 5 more book chats in the next 2 months somehow. So please join us for the future discussions. And above all, thank you, Nathan, for this wonderful book and many, many congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you so much, David, Marlene, Bob. Thank you for this wonderful conversation. I'm really grateful. Thank you.